He thought he had the city in the palm of his hand, glass towers bending beneath his name, men who moved like chess pieces at a whisper, a fiancé whose smile polished his reputation. The rain that night only made his world shinier. Droplets racing across the Maybach's bulletproof glass, streetlights smeared into gold. He was headed home from a fundraiser, an evening of speeches, handshakes, applause that smelled faintly of citrus and ambition, when something, or someone, split the reflection in the window and turned his whole life sideways. She was a figure at the crosswalk, back bent against the wind, a cheap raincoat clinging to her shoulders like a secret. Two tiny heads bobbed under a single threadbare umbrella, a stroller, a diaper bag slung like an afterthought. She looked smaller than he remembered. She looked exactly like the woman who had slipped out of his life years ago and taken with her the one thing he thought he'd buried, except there were two small faces now. Twin boys, one dozing against a cheek, the other blinking at the rain like it was painted glass. Damien Moretti watched through the tinted pane and felt an animal noise in his chest, something old and raw and utterly inconvenient. For a moment he was nothing but the man in the car, hands folded, breath fogging, a prince made small by surprise. The red light held them there, the city pausing as if to witness. Sophia sat beside him, in a gown cut sharper than her expression. She sipped a champagne flute she did not finish, unaware of the collapse occurring behind the rain. He did not raise his voice to Luca. He did not need to. Luca's hand, a shadow at the edge of the frame, moved with habitual readiness. Damien opened the car without a word and walked toward the curb with wet shoes that knew how to make a sound unheard in rooms where men spoke softly about power. The rain patted him. The city smelled like iron and asphalt. The stroller smelled faintly of spilled milk and something sugary, bakery sweet, and very human. He stepped into the night and something like a memory reached for him. Ivana Bella, her laugh, a different country. She had been a ghost in his past, the way some mistakes become comfortable furniture. He had believed the absence of proof was proof itself. Now the proof was moving between puddles, watching the world as if it had betrayed her. And the two small phases, little crescents of trust, were fixed on the world as if they had never been taught to fear it. He almost lost his footing on the curb. For a single, incandescent second, the old, more dangerous part of him, strategist, predator, king of the underside, rose like a film on pond water. Then a quieter, older thing spoke. Those were his children. The subway swallowed the corner with the typical, indifferent veracity of a metropolis. The screech, the iron breath, the fluorescent tunnel. Damien's feet pounded twice, then faster. Present tense stole his senses. He is running. Rain slicking into his lashes. Breath hurt like a question. People blur. The stroller is a moving island. Ivana pushes with a single, stubborn grace that says she has practiced not breaking. He calls her name and it comes out thin, an inadequate rope. She glances back and sees him. For an instant their eyes lock, his, a hard coin of ownership and penitence, hers, a flint striking against the realities of a life fortified by fear. Eitoren, aribestors, breathe open and close. The metal pulse is decisive. The crowd folds into the carriage like migrating birds. Damien reaches the platform as the doors hiss shut. He slams his hand against glass. He presses his forehead against the cool safety window and watches the stroller jostle away, two tiny hands waving at whatever small amusement the tunnel supplies. The train eats distance in subway speed gulps. The city, indifferent, keeps its lights where they are. He stands there with the rain in his hair, feeling something heavier than rage, the full, raw throb of responsibility he never asked for and cannot shed. Back inside the Maybach, the world is instantly clinical. The leather, the soft hum of the engine, like a small heart that keeps beating, because that is what engines do. Sophia's hand finds his, not with warmth, but with a calculation that would make a ledger blush. She says something about the speech and its success. Her tone carries the practiced architecture of a woman who frames every misstep as an opportunity. Damien looks at her and the side of her is suddenly narrower, as if a window has been shuttered. He does not respond to noise. He gives Luca the single order he always gives in moments that require a law without witnesses. Find out who she is. Quietly? Quickly. He called Mr. Henderson the private investigator as if he were ordering coffee. Short, efficient, no small talk. Henderson sounded like a man who keeps his hands busy so his mouth can be careful. He promised photographs, a name, a lead on where the train had taken them. Within hours a burned phone pinged with images. A woman, in an apron, behind a counter dusted in flour. Two boys, in identical knit caps, staring at the camera with the open, inquisitive boldness of twins. The images were taken from a distance, grainy and cruelly intimate. Someone had watched them learn their own faces. An hour later, in the private light of Damien's study, the photos were spread out like evidence and like a map to a place his conscience could not refuse. Each picture was a small, exploding truth. One image had been taken in front of a bakery whose sign read "Ordinary, then poetic Bella's bread." The irony was not lost. Ivana's hands, flower-printed, were captured mid-knead in a shot that smelled of mourning and honest labor. The boys were leaning against the counter, each trying to reach for a sugar cookie. There were no guards in those frames, no men in the background, no obvious sign of the kind of protection his life had always kept at the margins. There was, however, an old bronze locket in Ivana's pocket, in one frame, something Damien had given her once on a rooftop. A poor thing that had aged like wood. The lab returned results with the kind of clinical punctuation that felt obscene given the life-changing content. A private genetics lab had run a comparison. The locket, a hair found in an old jacket, a database, records stored away like an unexamined relic, and the match read like a verdict. The boys were his. DNA. Moretti. Damien folded the paper with fingers that stopped obeying. The numbers did not explain how someone had protected them, how Ivana had kept silence for years, or the nights she must have sat awake counting dangers that had names and faces. He went back to the bakery before the sun rose and found her standing in a small room that smelled of yeast and lemon, her hair tied back in an apron with flour on the shoulder, each movement practical and unadorned. She did not startle when he entered. The first sound she made was not a squeal of surprise but the slow, steady taking in of breath of someone who has learned to count the cost of strangers. Noah and Ethan. Noah with a stubborn cowlick that refused to be tamed. Ethan with a curious scar at his eyebrow that looked like a question were asleep in a cot in the corner. Two small bodies curled like commas. A radio whispered in the back, playing an old Italian record that Arthur, the old butler, used to hum on quieter days. The bakery was a small, domestic universe. Ivana's face carried history. A line at the mouth where a smile had been held in reserve, eyes that mirrored exhaustion and an iron-slow courage. She had not called him. She had not sought his help. She had walked a mile away and built a life that avoided his world, the way a delicate thing avoids light. The boys were proof that some things he had assumed he lost were only hidden. He did not tell her everything at once. He learned instead, like a man recalling a language he had once known, the details in measured, careful breaths. The threats first whispers, then notes left in mailbox IZ begun when she refused to be pushed out of the only apartment she could afford. Someone had been trying to make her disappear from a certain street, a certain census of gossip. She had taken the boys and moved until the city swallowed their scent. It was so simple and so monstrous in its effect. She had traded a safer life for a life where no one knew her name. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked once, in the narrow hush between coffee orders and the clatter of pans. His voice was not hard. It was asking a ledger to balance. "Because I had you," she said. "Because when you were around, danger looked like a promise. And the boys were safer without your name attached. Maybe I was wrong." There was a pause where the hum of the oven seemed to be the only jury. "You named them," Damien said. "Who named them?" She looked at the sleeping children's away. A sentinel studies a map and said, quietly, "I did." He wanted to argue, to bargain, to reach back to the old days when a word from him could move whole blocks. Instead, he watched the children breathe. Two small ribs expanded in unison. A thumb found a cheek. He had never imagined tenderness this large would arrive wrapped in crumbs and flour and sleepless mornings. The more he looked, the more certain he was that his choice would not be a singular thing. Everything he had built leaned on decisions made in the dark. This demanded a different kind of decision. Henderson brought him more than pictures. He brought a thin envelope with receipts and a photograph of a burner phone's last registered location. Useless scrap if it were in any other story, but in this one, it tugged at a thread. The location pointed toward the upper side of the city, the part where glass elbows marble, and where invitations arrive with engraved envelopes. Henderson's voice when he delivered the news had the tired tone of a man who had seen his share of small salvations and large ruins. The burner phone had once pinged near the Sterling residence. That did not make Sophia Sterling the author of every sorrow. It made her a pawn or a player, and in the world Damien inhabited there was seldom much of a difference. He held the mapping like a hot coal. The implication cut a neat shape. Sophia Sterling was not just the name on glossy invitation cards. She was the daughter of a senator, and the senator was a man whose politics relied on immaculate public images. For someone like Sophia, a past like Ivana's could be a story worth burying. Damien felt the city's geometry reorient beneath him. Political favor, televised acceptance, alliances, these things had weight. So did children. He did not tell Ivana everything Henderson had offered. She did not need a list of geopolitical casualties or a map of influence. She needed a promise that kept children safe. She needed proof that they would not be shoved back into the dark where dangers had long memories. He offered what he could. A car ride, a room with a crib, men at the gate whose names he assumed no one least of all the people he loved and feared would bring to mind dinners at embassies. She said nothing for the first night. The bakery provided them with loaves wrapped in wax paper. Neighbors left casseroles in the cool of morning like small treaties. Returning to the estate with Ivana and the boys felt like carrying two worlds into collision. Damien had been king of a court that wore suits and polished accents. He now brought in a woman whose hands smelled of flour and a pair of kids who wore mismatched socks like small flags of resilience. Arthur, the head butler, received them like someone greeting an unexpected storm. He nodded once, his face a practiced mask, then asked quietly where he should put the baby blankets. Staff adjusted and stilled and continued the ballet of a house that preferred predictable misfortune to messy mercy. Sophia noticed before anyone else could make a ceremonial mistake. She was in the great hall, circulating among portraits and carefully curated furniture, when a hush fell, and she saw Ivana by the doorway with two small boys, linked to her hip like an ordinary miracle. For a second, neither woman spoke. Sophia's smile did not fold. It sharpened. Her brain went to accounting immediately. Every social climb is an equation, and the arrival of these lives was a variable she had not budgeted. Damien, she said, the name a polished thing. There was no question there. There was also no warmth. The room arranged itself around her like dancers finding their marks. He introduced them with an economy that had become his language. This is Ivana. These are my sons, Noah and Ethan. Sophia's expression was an essay of controlled implosion. Surprise, calculation, then a practiced sympathy. She stepped forward, nothing abrupt, her voice a cool varnish. How unexpected! Words that mean absolution and words that mean indictment are sometimes the same, shaped differently by tone. She asked the perfunctory questions, the children's ages, the logistics of their care, with the kind of foe concerned someone with a public life has perfected for cameras. Damien understood every syllable, as if it were a coin dropped onto a ledger. He could see the universe of headlines she was already sketching in her head. The scandal, the distraction, the charity gala that would scrub the anatomy of this revelation. He could see the senator's staffers making quiet notations about votes and optics. Ivana stood straight, small, and stubborn and steady. She answered Sophia with a courtesy that had been refined by need. She did not lunge at the easy humiliation. Instead, she offered the reality of a woman who had been protective and resolute, and who had not come to be anyone's spectacle. That dignity, quiet as it was, cut through the room. There was a friction in the staff's reactions. Some looked at Damien with new curiosity, wondering which speculation this would afford them at kitchen tables. Others, like Luca, moved with a neutral muscle, protective more than obedient. Sophia kept to herself. Her eyes were knives she learned to disguise as observation. Arthur, the house's long-serving face, kept his voice even and his movements steady. He asked about meals for the boys and seemed to understand, with the patient cruelty of an old man, that this house would need to rearrange its rhythms. At night, Damien lay awake in a room that suddenly felt like a borrowed suit. The estate made small noisy pipes, distant footsteps of men who did not belong in bedrooms anymore, and he could not stop the arithmetic in his head. He loved control. He also now loved two small, imperfect breaths that entered the house like new law. Loyalty to an empire, or loyalty to a family. He had always told himself that the two could be the same, if maneuvered with skill. He was beginning to suspect that certain loyalties demand a different kind of bravery. As days passed, the boys began to learn a language of their own in the house. Noah roamed the corridors like a small captain. Ethan found refuge in the folds of Arthur's overcoat during quiet afternoons. They insisted on trained small wooden ones that clicked along tracks like little governments, and they left fingerprints on the polished table with the kind of innocence that suggested no one in Damien's life had ever been allowed to be so simply themselves. There were small acts that revealed the gulf between Ivana's life and Sophia's plans. Ivana taught the boys to press flour into cookies and to hide cookie crumbs in their hair like treasures. Sophia arranged flowers' orchids, sterile and perfect, in the main hall. The orchids belonged to a world of presentation, fragile, curated, intended to tell a story about wealth that will not imprint with dirt. Ivana brought daisies from the bakery's alley and set them in jam jars. They looked at home in ways no cultivated orchid ever could. Conversations between Damien and Sophia became exercises in negotiation and omission. She never directly asked him to rid the house of Ivana. Instead, she spoke of distractions and unfortunate headlines in quoted, balanced tones. The senator called 3 times in as many days in a voice that demanded recompense from any vascularized artery of the city. The staff rearranged schedules to hide the presence of the boys during daytime tours. Social calendars were edited like sensitive documents in a drawer. Damien tried to meet Sophia's eyes and found he could not hold her gaze the way he used to. Shame or responsibility, he could not tell. Her smile had always been a tool. He had once used it as armor. Now it felt like the blade of a ruler measuring the wrongness of his affections. She suggested he considered the political implications of embracing children no one had expected. She spoke, cool and deliberate, of alliances and of what marriage symbolized for both of them. He listened and considered the arithmetic. Each phrase she used was a chess move cast in silk. Ivana watched these conversations with a mix of distrust and a weary curiosity that felt like a small, stern baptism. She had no illusions about the corrosive nature of wealth and of the people who guarded it. She had seen what his kind of life could do to the things she loved. But she also saw the men at the gates and felt a tentative safety she had not known in years. There was a look she sometimes gave Damien, brief and private, that said, "I hope this is different." Luca, whose hands remembered more than his mouth would say, kept to the perimeter like an old friend in a new war. He was the kind of man who could move a room without pomp. He understood the calculus of protection. Keep the small things safe, and the larger things will find their own cracks. He also understood the narrower thing Damien's newly fragile heart. In the kitchen he would make a dry joke that made Damien laugh once, a sound like a key sliding into a lock. One evening, near the hearth, a trapdoor in the social landscape caught them all off guard. A forgotten burner phone Henderson had flagged earlier rang, and the ping landed on Damien's secure line by mistake, a ghost reach-in. The sound was small and obscene in the hush. Henderson's advice was practical. Investigate quietly before letting the house be a stage. Damien's reply was not a question of who had the right to demand privacy. It was a calculation about whether to fight with a scalpel or a sledge. The burner phone's metadata, Henderson's term, said quickly, and then tucked away, hinted at movement near the Sterling residence. The Senate map of influence glowed faintly in his mind. He felt his history with Sophia Kirtle into a different question. How many people had been pushed out of the way with a polished hand so a future could be built on polished trust? He had given the world his bravado, and it had given him power. Now it offered him an arithmetic he had not expected. The possibility that his empire had been built over undisclosed truths. and that his betrothal had been a clean varnish disguised as love, he confronted Sophia in a room where the house felt its age-heavy curtains, framed photographs of a past family that pretended to be spotless. Her face, always a practiced mask, softened into a private hurt a fraction of a degree. Words were measured, barbed in the way that well-dressed knives sometimes are. "You've been looking for trouble," she said, deliberately misreading his intention as a misstep he should correct. "No," he said. "I found it." He placed a photograph of the boys on the desk. The image was small and stubborn. Sophia's fingers brushed the top of the paper like someone reading another's signature. "These children," she said slowly, "are an inconvenient truth." She kept the emphasis clinical, as if discomfort were a thing to be solved by better lighting. "There's more to it than that," Damien said. "Someone has been following her." There were threats. Sophia's eyes flickered like a shadow passing across a marble statue. For half a breath she looked, if only for an observer to be startled. Then her face recomposed. "Who?" she asked. It was an innocent question baited with a woman's ability to curl suspicion into currency. "Someone who knows how to make a past vanish," he answered. He was not accusing. Not yet. He was cataloging. The truth remained stubbornly, infuriatingly partial. She exhaled, and the sound had the air of a woman who had rehearsed indignation. "If this is a gambit," she said, "to pull me into scandal," her voice smoothed factory crisp. "It is not a gambit," he said. "It is my obligation. Those boys are mine." Sophia's expression did not break, but behind it, something like intent hardened, and in that second, Damien saw the outlines of a future where love would compete with influence and power. She would not relinquish the stage without a plan. That knowledge would set the shape of the battles to come. He took his son's photographed faces and carried them into the nightlight contraband. The rain had stopped. The city had rinsed its street of the night's confessions. The house, with all of its rooms and rooms of rooms, had to absorb a new weather. Damien paced the marble hallways, feeling the cool tiles underfoot like scales. He did not feel lighter. He felt the weight of what a name could mean, and of what a child's life could reorder in a world built of promises and policies. He walked up to the window and watched his own reflection fracture across the city like a cracked mirror. "You are a man of consequence," he told himself. And yet suddenly he was only a man who needed to protect two small lives from forces that could not be blunted by muscle alone. Power, he was discovering, had a more complicated grammar when toddlers were involved. That night, in the room he had once shared with notions of control, he made a choice he would later understand as the hinge of his life. He would not send men to burn the bakery. He would not silence people who had been silenced. He would be invisible in his protection if invisibility would shield the boys. He would not make a parade of their rescue. He would learn, however slowly, a different vocabulary of influence, one of shelter and smallness, of denying headlines to men who traded in spectacle. Word of the boys moved quietly through the city's underbelly like a rumor that tastes like lemon. Men with long memories and short tempers came by the gates to offer quiet condolences and curiously helpful advice. All in the language of territory and credit. Others, like Victor Cray's lieutenants, sniffed opportunity. Damien listened. He did not decide. Not yet! In the small hours, while the house slept and the boys' breaths made small waves against the baby monitor, Damien stepped outside and held the iron key that Arthur, with a polite solemnity, had offered him on the day the estate was protest, a key that unlocked a gate nobody else had the patience to open. He turned it over in his mouth of fingers. The metal was cool and familiar. For years, iron had been an emblem of things he kept closed. Tonight it felt like a promise he had not yet defined. He did not give the key away. He held it as a vow against space and rumor. The city, loud and indifferent, continued on its axis. But something had shifted its orbit. The sight of a woman and two boys at a crosswalk had shifted his category from ruler to a man whose life would now be measured by different things: bedtime stories, broken toys, scraped knees, and the harsh arithmetic of public life. When dawn pressed against the blinds and the boys rose with solemn, stubborn joy, the house felt less like a fortress and more like a place that could be lived in. Noah wanted trains. Ethan wanted jam. Ivana, for the first time perhaps in many years, laughed in the kitchen in a way that sounded like forgiveness. Damien watched them from the doorway and saw how badly he wanted to be the kind of man they could depend on. Outside, the city resumed its calculus. Henderson had more notes. The burner phone's trail had been checked and doubled, and somewhere in the grid of the political map a finger hovered above a name that mattered. Inside, the house rearranged itself around a new truth. Children had arrived, and with them the exigency to act not only with muscle but with a strategy that could protect them and hold truth to light. He had a decision to make. He could choose the immediate comfort of eliminating a problem, of sending a clear message that no one could touch his family with impunity. Or he could choose a slower, colder course. Gather evidence, expose the lie, and force a public accounting that would be noisier and more dangerous, but might strip the scandal of its secrecy and defend the children in the long run. He chose to step back from instinct and toward a plan whose beginning he could not yet see in full. That choice would cost him in ways he had never counted. It would make enemies of people whose faces he had learned to ignore over the years. It would force alliances he had never imagined he'd make. It would ask of him sacrifices of image and territory and perhaps, in ways he could not yet predict, pieces of himself. For now, he allowed himself a small mercy. He watched as the boys toppled a wooden train and then, together, rebuilt it with a solemn, comical concentration. He listened to the sound of their laughter, simple and immediate, and felt, for the first time, in many nights, an ache that was not hunger for power, but hunger for something softer. If you love a twisty crime, love story, tap like and subscribe to follow the fallout. Days blurred into a kind of strategic tenderness. Henderson fed him fragments. A credit card trace to a boutique near the Sterling compound. A waitress who remembered seeing a woman matching Sophia's profile hand a man an envelope in a dim lobby years ago. A ledger with a name penciled in the margin. Each fragment was a lighted stairstep towards something greater and more dangerous. He filed them somewhere in his skull where maps were kept. Ivana and the boys settled into a rhythm of small, happiness-noisy breakfasts. Accidental naps on the morning couch. A constant trail of tiny socks. Damien found himself awake in the night, walking them to the window where the city pressed against the glass, watching Noah press his nose fogged by breath against the pane and declare, solemnly, that the trains were his kingdom. Damien wondered how kingdoms felt when the ruler's hands were smaller and meant for bandages and bedtime stories, instead of ledgers and suits. Sophia, meanwhile, gathered her composure like a dress, making arrangements for a future she still assumed would be televised and applauded. She took up the mantle of engagement with a performer's cool. She arranged guests and pressed invitations, never once letting on that the social scaffold around her trembled. She took her seat once a week for a portrait in which she posed with the Senator Vere, image of a woman whose life was built to be unassailable. And yet there were moments, quiet, dangerous moments, when Damien saw the thin line under her politeness, an intent that could be constructive or destructive. He steeled himself. This was not a matter of vengeance. This was not the old currency of fear and silent men. This was something that demanded a kind of legalistic patience he had always been inclined to mock. He found himself, ironically, learning to play the patient game. Henderson asked for leeway. Public takedown, he said once, is a different kind of war. It needs breathing room. Pressure and haste could blow the kids out of the sky. Damien nodded. He had always liked the feel of decisive action. But the boys had reoriented his taste. When Noah leaned against his shin and smiled, the calculation shifted again. There were nights, rare but burning, when the old instinct returned like an itch. He would move around the estate's perimeter in the dark with Luca at his shoulder, and there would be a taste in his mouth for retribution. He kept those nights to himself. There were other nights, quieter, when he read to the boys, and the words sounded like absolution for no one but himself. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked, silently, for the chance to be true to these small lives. Then, one morning, while the children were at the bakery, being taught how to shape dough into little animals, Henderson knocked on the door with a look that meant the city's calculus had shifted again. He had found something else. Not yet a ledger splayed like evidence on a table, but a pattern of behavior and a trail of favors that suggested a hidden architecture. The burner phone had spoken in a language he had been, more often than not, able to translate. Damien listened without betraying what he felt. The fact of the boys being his had altered the geometry of his life irrevocably. He could feel the city's gaze refocusing. Allies were now eyes with agendas. Enemies were faces that smiled like threats. He had accepted, quietly, that power would cost him more than it ever had before. A life of discretion in which the boys were safe. A life where his hands would be gentler, where his decisions would be measured against cribs and cookie crumbs. He had also decided, privately, that he would not dismantle the world of influence simply to protect his small family. He would use that world, uncomfortably and carefully, to place a protective ring around the boys. He would not pretend his hands were clean. He would not claim a sainthood he had never earned, but he would claim fatherhood, and he would let it guide the rest of his choices. The morning he was to introduce the boys at a small, carefully arranged luncheon for a select few friends. A sealed envelope arrived at the house under the hand of a courier. There was no stamp, no return, only a name and the suggestion of inevitability. Arthur opened it with a face that had served 100 family secrets and never blinked. He handed it to Damien with the deliberation of a man who knows when history has the decency to knock politely first. Inside was a photograph. It was the kind of photograph that had a way of remapping loyalties. It showed a woman Sophia on a terrace, her hand steady, passing a folded piece of paper to a man whose face had been seen in Henderson's earlier notes. The picture was not enough on its own to hang a man, but it suggested a choreography that was intimate, deliberate, and ugly. In the corner, there was a flash date, scrawled in tiny font. It corresponded to the same week Ivana had left. Damien sat very still, the paper cutting him like a small truth. He placed the photograph on the table and watched as the paper trembled in his hands. There were no fireworks, no trumpet blasts, only a realization that the social scaffolding he had assumed was clean might be riddled with cobwebs. He did not act rashly. He did not call men to arms or drive to the Startling compound with torches. He folded the photograph and placed it in his pocket. He decided, build a case that could not be scoffed away as rumor or malice. He wanted facts. He wanted public exposure that could not be cleaned with press statements. He obeyed, with the curious humility of a man learning a new religion, a strategy that asked for patience as an instrument of protection. The house turned, quietly, toward an experiment to protect 2 boys by using every resource at his disposal without letting his instinct for violence be the lever to pry open the city's doors. He would let the law do what law could, the underworld do what the underworld could without creating a spectacle that would harm the children. He learned to ask for time, which in his world was a kind of currency he rarely had to spend with caution. The first phase of the plan was simple and dangerous. Secure the boys, establish legal paternity in a way that could not be scoffed at, and then begin threading the case through channels that would lead to exposure of whoever had tried to make a family disappear. For all his power, Damien knew the truth that the world of men in suits and men in alleys was 2 halves of the same coin. He had to flip it carefully. He was not naive. He was not certain. But when Noah wrapped his small arms around his neck and whispered, "Papa," in a voice too big for a throat so small, Damien understood that there was no option to return to business as before. The city's chessboard reconfigured. The pieces he loved were now the pieces he would protect, at any cost that would not endanger the boys themselves. He lit a cigarette once and then crushed it out, feeling the old ritual of ash, and a final exhale, like a book closing on the past. He stepped out into a courtyard that smelled faintly of cut grass and baby sleep and city rain that had not yet begun. He held the iron key again between his thick fingers, feeling the weight of what it might later unlock. There were messages to write and secrets to dig. There were things to be done that would require allies he did not know he needed. But for one perfect, fragile minute, the house was quiet and the boys slept in a way that suggested the world was safe. If only for now. Damien watched the moonlight pool on the parquet and thought of the train that had taken his past away and given him his future in a single, terrible, miraculous motion. He would build a case, he decided. He would not seek to erase the man he had been, but he would try to become the man his sons deserved. The decision sat inside him like a new bone, uncomfortable, necessary, and impossible to ignore. He turned the key in his hand once, twice, like a prayer he had not learned how to say yet. Around him, the city hummed, and somewhere not far away, a life that had once been shared with him moved on and would be his to protect or to lose. He turned the key in his hand once, twice, like a prayer he had not yet learned how to say. Outside the house, the city recalibrated itself around the fact of two small boys he had not known he needed. Inside, he would need to build a case that could survive cameras and counsel, steel and subpoena. The work he chose next would be quieter than the violence he knew how to issue. It would also be more complex. Henderson came with evidence folded into envelopes like patient instruments. The burner phone's metadata had a stubborn pattern: pings near a terrace, a concierge's log that remembered a late guest, the memory of a night desk clerk who sold his silence for the right price. The thin photographic proof suggested more than coincidence. It suggested a choreography. Damien sat at his desk and laid each fragment out like a surgeon arranging tools, methodical, mindful, precise. He did not want a rumor. He wanted something that could be presented in a room with air conditioning and witnesses and a judge who could not be bought by optics. He needed a partner who did not ask niceties about ethics when the money tasted bitter. He needed Victor Cray. Their meeting was not a fish over coffee, it was an arrangement at the docks, where fog and freight made conversation private and the river reminded the city that some things flowed whether men liked it or not. Cray received him in a low room with a window facing water and cranes like sleeping dinosaurs. He was dressed in a sweater that pretended to be casual and eyes that practiced patience. He had the look of a man who had traded romance for enterprise and found the arithmetic for. "You're asking a favor," Cray said, not looking surprised, as if favors were only curves on an otherwise straight road. "I'm asking for something more than a favor," Damien answered. He did not lie. "You help me make these people public, and I give you the docks back, clean, full concession, full paperwork. You want access? I want evidence. We make a trade." Cray smiled, the sort of smile that admits nothing of sentiment. "You give territory to someone who used to take it with muscle," he said. "You sure you aren't just handing me more leverage to take the rest?" Damien did not pretend generosity. "I am sure I can live without a few docks if my children can grow up free of threats and smear campaigns." Cray studied him as if considering currency in a new complexion. "You know what I want," he said finally. It was not a demand. It was a fact. Cray wanted legitimacy in the market that mattered. He wanted ports to look clean on invoices, men in jackets instead of men with grudges. He wanted a known quantitive. He could get it. He could scale. Damien had the leverage to offer that. Cray could and would deliver information only his channels and his accountants could reach. They circled each other with professional courtesy, like predators who had invented a polite handshake. Cray wanted paperwork and a guarantee that the transfer would not be a trap. Damien wanted proof, ledgers, and the identity of the men who had made life unsafe for a woman with flour on her hands. In the end, they reached the usual compromise between Old World muscle and New World ledger. A signed paper that meant something in courtrooms and account books. An exchange orchestrated by men who could make such exchanges look like commerce instead of capitulation. Cray produced what only someone with a network could: copies of small ledgers, an accountant's note, cross-reference to the same shell companies that showed up in Henderson's marginalia, and names that vibrated like a list of people who could not be allowed to stand in the light. He did not give the whole stack. He gave enough to begin the legal machine. That was his price. He demanded docks, and did not pretend to regret the exchange. Damien signed then, slow and sure, feeling a new kind of debt settle in his chest. Henderson and Cray's contacts stitched a narrative out of fragments. The ledgers showed a pattern. Payments routed through innocuous LLCs, invoices too clean to be real. A name that recurred like a nasty chorus: Sterling Investments, a facade, thin as paper. The burner phone's last ping was less a map than a toe in the water. It suggested proximity to the Sterling residence at the time when threats had been delivered. Video clips surfaced cracked phone footage that did not need to be cinematic to be damning. In one clip, A hand that matched the length of Sophia's fingers accepted an envelope from a suited man who had appeared in Henderson's notes. In another, a voice muffled, but distinct, spoke of a problem that needed cleaning up. The pieces began to look like a pattern. Damien, for the first time in his life, did not move by instinct alone. He moved by counsel. He sought Special Agent Miller because law has a way of turning rumor into warrant when evidence is offered in the right room. Miller was the kind of man who smelled of dry paper and discipline. He did not like theatrics, and he did not enjoy playing favorites. When Damien offered evidence, he offered it with the bluntness of a man who knew the cost of incomplete triumphs. "This is damning," Miller said, after watching the videos and flipping through copies of ledgers on a secure laptop. "But you bring it in too close to the family. If you make a spectacle and the kids get hurt in the process, you won't like the consequences." Damien had expected Miller to say that. He had not expected the man to look at him with something that almost resembled pity. "I know what I want," Damien said. "I don't want violence. I want law. I want exposure." Miller's response was a small nod. "We can build a case, but it requires patience and corroboration. We need more than ledgers and a burner phone. We need witnesses, financial trails, something that ties the senator directly. Also, public exposure before we're ready gives them a chance to bury the evidence, intimidate witnesses." And he paused. "There are child services, and they will act in a way that may look hostile to you. You must be prepared for legal processes, to be blunt." The warning about CPS hung in the air like a winter cloud. Damien appreciated its bluntness. The stakes had shifted. He wanted to avoid harming the boys while destroying the tower of lies that endangered them. Miller agreed, reluctantly, and with a professional oath, to coordinate when a legal strike could be made. He could, Miller said, move with extraordinary speed if the evidence supported it, but the evidence had to be ironclad. They began building an ironclad case. Henderson worked, as he always had, like a man who collects the small items most people never notice. Receipts, anonymous witness statements, a motel card, an offhand clerk's observation. Cray's accountants produced cross-verified copies of payments and the names of the shell companies that had facilitated transfers. Miller's team moved quietly, securing wiretaps with paperwork they presented in dim rooms where men like senators rarely walked. It was all delicate choreography. 4 days, Damien lived inside the strategy like a man who had learned a new language. He read ledgers, not as numbers, but as stories. He learned the names of companies and the time signatures of bank deposits. He sat in rooms with men in suits and men who smelled of oil and grease, and realized both could speak the same tongue if taught to translate. Then the city showed its other face, bureaucratic and blunt. A complaint, filed anonymously and with the ferocity of a political machine, landed on a social worker's desk. It was the kind of complaint that could be generated by a single photograph misfiled or by a staffer working for someone who wanted an advantage. The complaint alleged neglect. It was the kind of accusation that demanded a response. The knock on the estate's door that morning was polite and procedural. A woman with a badge introduced herself as a social worker and explained, in soft but businesslike terms, that an anonymous caller had alleged that the children in Damien Moretti's care required immediate evaluation. Her tone had no malice. She repeated phrases like precautionary and welfare check with the cadence of a woman who had learned to make compassion sound like procedure. Ivana sat on the couch with a baby in her lap and the other crawling at her feet. Noah looked up at the visitor with the incurious curiosity of a child who expects adults to be loud and odd. Damien stood at the window, fingers pressed into cold glass, and felt the old chemical itch of violence rise like bile. He restrained it. There was a line now that was not merely legal. It was the line of his sons' lives. He would not cross it. The social worker performed her duties with the grim professionalism the system demands. She asked about routines and sleep patterns. She made notes. Damien watched the small, inevitable machinery of state move. There was no Bakley solution that protected the kids and didn't expose them. There was only the slow, infuriating, necessary process of law. Within hours, CPS had taken custody of Noah and Ethan for a temporary placement pending a fuller investigation. The shelter was a bland and clean place, designed to make emergencies feel administratively resolute. Ivana watched them go with a contained grief that did not look like the exaggerated collapse some reporters would later describe. She did not scream. She did not cry theatrically. She asked one question over and over with a kind of quiet insistence. Will they be safe? Damien felt all the rage assemble into a single, hard shape. He could have answered with muscle, with the very thing the system feared most. But he had chosen a different path. He had gambled that the public, the law, and the underbelly could be forced to intersect at a point that protected the children. He swallowed his fury and called Mila. Do not let them be harmed, he said. Simply, I will not make this about a gun. Miller's voice was dry over the phone. You do as I say, and you don't act. We are moving faster, but you must keep your hands clean. Damien obeyed not because he feared the law, but because he feared the consequences of violating trust that could be shattered irreparably. If a single stray bullet or reckless act endangered the boys, he arranged lawyers. He arranged a watchful presence outside the shelter, men who did nothing more than stand and breathe. He let the law do what the law could do. He let the underworld do what it did best. Use influence in corners and back rooms, but, he insisted, with the metal that had once made men fear him, that no harm come to the children. Victor Cray performed his part with a pragmatic efficiency that smelled faintly of profit and a kind of grudging respect. He applied pressure on the shelter's administrative chain through channels that did not require violence, phone calls that referenced city contracts, gentle reminders of consequences for administrative overreach. It was influence, not force. It was leverage, not brutality. The shelter's director, unnerved by the attention and by a quiet legal inquiry that had just arrived asking for cooperation, made a decision that would be described later as irregular and judged in a different center of power as merely expedient. The director allowed a supervised, temporary transfer of custody for specific transportation to a neutral, legal setting where Miller's team would conduct interviews. When Cray's men arrived to collect the boys for the move to the arranged site, Damien watched from a distance, fist curled like someone holding a memory. He felt like a man who had learned to wait to weather storm fronts that used to be cleared with men and guns. He watched Ivana pick up her children, the four of them Ivana, 2 small boys, and the adult who had once ruled an empire move through a building that smelled like institutional bleach and procedural care. Cray's lieutenant met them at the curb with a nod, and then the group disappeared into a vehicle that was, by arrangement, purely administrative. It was a theft that the papers would later call a rescue. In truth, it was a negotiated extraction. No men raised weapons. No blood was spilled. But it was not neat. It left edges that would later invite legal scrutiny and commentators who loved to draw moral lines into public sand. Damien sheltered his feelings. He kept the kind of silence that had guarded other secrets. In the days that followed, Henderson, Miller, and Cray moved pieces in tandem. The ledgers were corroborated, witness testimony assembled, and a legal team prepared the paperwork that would allow Miller to make arrests. The plan they built was surgical and public. Evidence would be presented in such a way that the Sterlings would not be able to leverage the narrative into a sympathetic counterargument. The idea was not merely to make arrests, but to make the truth visible. In a city built on appearances, visibility is an instrument. The moment arrived at the wedding. Not the wedding that had been planned, Sophia's wedding to Damien Booth. The wedding that had been arranged as a stage by people who did not suspect it would be used as a theater of exposure. The cathedral had been chosen for its marble and its echo, a place where stained glass gilded sign with light. Guests arrived in their shells of civility, men with suits like armor, women with laughter like a pretense. The senator grinned, secure in a public life that had long buffered him from private storms. Camrusto's faithful insects of modern life sat like accurate flies, capturing reflections. Damien had consented to the wedding out of a social calculation that had once been purely political. Now he consented because he understood the value of a room filled with witnesses. He did not step down the aisle to meet Sophia, as the city expected a man to meet his future. he climbed instead to a place from which he could speak and be seen. He had arranged, with Miller, for a projection to be available, framed as a documentary montage of lives and pledges. The cathedral's screens were generous, meant to show vows and photographs. No one suspected they would show ledger entries. The organ began, the light in the stained glass settled, a basin of color over the congregation. Words were sada thrum of rehearsed sentiment. The cameras watched Damien as if he were the hero of a conventional tale. He stood, at first, like a man who had been asked to play a part. Then he moved. "I thought this day would be about promises," he said into a microphone, his voice at first low and calm. The organ softened to listen. "But I learned this week that promises can be used as tools for erasure." He flicked a small remote he had kept hidden. The projection came alive. It began with photographs Sanderson's grainy images of a woman at a bakery, of two boys with crumb-dusted faces. A hush went through the crowd. The cathedral, paradoxically, made the small images gigantic. Heads turned, the senator's expression tightened. Then the screen filled with numbers ledgers that had been translated into plain language by Miller's team. Names that had been figments on a page now sat under the cold light of the projector. Shell company transactions marched across the screen, with payments dated and annotated. A video clip played, short and damning, of a hand passing a folded note to a suited figure. The man's face blurred, but the hand could be recognized by a ring captured in the video in a blink that was now a fact. The cathedral's air changed. There was an audible intake, as if the building were learning the truth live. On the nave, the senator rose, as if to speak. His voice slid into the marble, smooth and practiced. "This is a private matter." Special Agent Miller stepped out in a suit that did not wear the pomp of the senator's world. He walked down the aisle like an ordinary man at prayer, and stopped before the congregation. "Sir," Miller said, and the word arrested the senator's sentence. He held up a folder. "We have probable cause. We have corroborated transactions and witness testimony. You and your daughter are under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, and related charges." It was the kind of phrasing civil servants used when they want to sound ironclad. Handcuffs appeared with a businesslike finality. Cameras moved toward them, the way sharks move toward any ripple that suggests meat. Sophia's face changed. The practiced smile flattered the edges of panic. The man who'd once taught her how to wear silence like a cape reached for the tissue of deniability and found it thin as gauze. Guests murmured, and the previously cordial distance between public image and private culpability collapsed in the space of Miller's proclamation. The senator's staffers made the calculations that would later become press releases. The senator's political machine, once so smooth, stuttered and choked on the sudden gust of truth. Outside, as the arrests were made, Victor Cray's men drove a small white van through a side entrance of the shelter. There were no sirens, only men who understood transactional timing. Ivana and the boys, escorted by a sheltered caseworker, arrived at the cathedral safe, legal, and exactly where Miller's team had arranged for them to be presented, in the public field where truth could not be hidden. Cray's lieutenant put the boys down at Damien's feet and then melted back into the crowd. An anonymous, useful presence who wanted payment for his part in the ledger of power. No one in the cathedral applauded. There was no victorious cheer. The moment was too complex for applause. It was instead a rearrangement of certainty. Damien bent and scooped his boys into his arms. They smelled of jam and the open, honest dampness of childhood. Noah laughed, high and untroubled. Ethan found Damien's collar and tugged as if to test the man's availability. Sophia, in the glare of the unfolding scandal, did not behave like a villain in a cheap novel. She behaved like someone whose house of cards had been collapsed by the weather. She looked at Damien with a complicated expression on it, mixture of betrayed calculation and the realization that no amount of connection or speech could knit the torn fabric of her life into something other than what it had been. Damien felt, in that public, terrible theater, the full weight of consequence. He had not orchestrated the arrests for spectacle. He had sought protection, but truth did not come without cost. The city would now examine him as well. Reporters were already murmuring about Moretti's ties and his bargain with Cray. Fooled by righteous optics, some would call him hypocrite, others would call him savior. He accepted neither label with grace. He only held his boys, felt their small hearts match his, and understood that he had not, in any court, purchased moral cleanliness. The startlings were processed. The senator's resignation came 3 days later. The press releases were neat and slow as a tide. The city began to realign. Some of Damien's enemies used the moment to attack him as a hypocrite. Miller's team, however, had built a careful enough record that anyone looking only for scandal would find more emptiness than they expected where public fury goes to die. The feds had chops, and they used them with a careful legal ethic that frustrated spin doctors. Cray received his docs. He accepted them with a smile that was economic, not religious. He set up a legal front, investments that would allow him to legitimate certain operations in ways that pleased men with suits and bank managers. Damien watched the handoff with a patriot's indifference to the currency that made it possible. The man who had once paid for silence with muscle now purchased infrastructure with contracts. They had both traded one for safety, one for expansion, and both came away with different things than they'd expected. Cray with access, Damien with custody. The months that followed were less cinematic than cameras expected. There were court hearings with the statutes Oberchoir of legal counsel. There were press cycles that tried to wrap the events into tidy morality plays. There were, too, quieter things. Damien transferred legal guardianship and many of the estate's management details in ways that protected the boys and made the house lighter to live in. He signed documents that put certain properties into evanescent legal, and to the astonishment of some, generous. He did not become saintly. He became pragmatic in his reallocation of assets. He allowed Arthur to keep a small apartment above the stables where he liked to nap. And he gave Luca a contract with more legitimate trappings. He bought a small parcel across the street from Bella's Bread and offered the bakery a new oven, under a legal liaison act of patronage compounded by a father's taste for jam. Ivana took to the change with a slow, wary grace. She was not an actress in a story. She was a woman who had stacked one day upon another until survival had become habit. Damien tried to make amends with actions, not words. He learned the soft logistics of everyday life, bringing diapers at midnight, attending pediatric visits, learning how a fever could turn a night into a contagion of worry. He learned awkwardly how to assemble a train track that would not collapse. His hands, once skilled at signatures and demands, found pleasure in stringing wooden tracks like small pieces of conquered territory. The boys grew. They learned to say "Papa" with the kind of tender ownership that restructured a man's priorities. They smeared jam on suit trousers with the kind of indifference that remade a wardrobe and humor. Noah, stubborn and bright, took to the mechanics of toy engines. Ethan, quieter, loved the rhythm of early mornings in the bakery where the flour clouded and the ovens breathed. Ivana set the boys' routines, and Damien followed them like a novice worshipper. He pretended competence and gradually acquired it. He was clumsy at bath time and capable in an emergency. He began to like bedtime because it meant him telling stories. He discovered he could solder a tale the way he had once soldered deals. His public life rewired itself. Some of his previous enterprises were restructured into legitimate holdings, a process that required him to step back not because he felt compelled by morality, but because he had decided that protection required a different kind of camouflage. He kept some of his old alliances, not because he couldn't survive without them, but because some relationships in his line of work are like old teeth, useful, despite their flaws. He remained, in the city's ledger, a complicated figure, neither saint nor villain, but a man of consequence who made choices that pleased no one completely. Victor Cray remained a constant background presence, less an ally than a necessary figure. They met occasionally over whiskey and accounts. Cray was pragmatic and uninterested in platitudes. "You wanted them safe?" he said once, watching Damien stir his drink. "You paid. We both got what we wanted." Damien could have called it purchase if that eased his conscience. He would not. He had, instead, a more complicated understanding of reciprocity. He paid in territory and influence. Cray paid with dirt that unmasked the startlings. Both men exchanged resources. Both men changed hands in their own way. Legal aftermath required its own sacrifice. Some of Damien's old lieutenants faced new scrutiny. The press loved to reduce stories to simple arcs. Empire falls, man learns, city applauds. But the legal processes were granular and patient. Damien sat through depositions, testified, and negotiated terms to ensure the boy's stability. He accepted a public reprimand and a restructuring of certain holdings costs. He measured in ways that had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with the quiet safety of his children. The bakery thrived in a way that was almost comically literal. People loved a story of redemption paired with pastry. Bella's bread grew a little. Then, a little more, Ivana took an apprentice. Damien bought the property across the street, not to launder reputation, but because he liked being close to the smell of yeast and because his sons liked to run through the alley with crumbs glued to their knees. He learned the names of the regular customers. He came early to help with heavy bags because he liked the honest backache of work that resulted in bread. Arthur kept the iron key, the same key Damien had once toyed with as a relic of a life both practical and symbolic. One afternoon, months after the arrests and the hearings, and the quiet reordering of power, Damien invited Ivana to the study. He had not proposed with a ring. Marriage had become an idea too complex for a single ornament. Instead, he opened a small wooden box and placed the iron key inside. It was polished but true, heavy in his palm. "I could give you a ring," he said, his voice soft and a touch unfamiliar. "I could make promises in the language the world understands. But I wanted to give you something that means what I actually meant. This is not an engagement. It's not a contract. He searched for words he had not used before. A promise to keep a gate open." Ivana looked at the key. She did not smile at once. She had been cautious of gestures that could be used as weapons in the past. But the key was honest. It was iron. It was not polished to pretense. She took the key and turned it in her fingers, feeling its weight a small, private currency. "What does it mean?" she asked. "That I will make room for this life," he said simply. "That protection does not mean control. That the house belongs to those who live it." She placed the key in her hand. "Then keep your hands where I can see them," she said, and there was humor at the base of it, a thread that had not been there before. They did not marry with pomp. The marriage that followed, when it happened months later, in a quiet registry, with a few witnesses, and a cake from Bella's bread, was a sort of small domestic event that terrified the tabloids with its lack of spectacle. It did, however, have all the elements that mattered. Steady promises, two boys who smeared frosting in the appropriate celebratory way, and a house that had learned to accommodate both grandeur and scraped knees. Damien's change did not erase consequences. The Startlings faced trials. The senator's indictment echoed across the city like a bell. Sophia faced her own reckoning. Public humiliation, legal consequences, and a private withdrawal into a life with less applause. She did not, in any redeeming montage, become a small coastal saint. She became someone whose choices had been exposed and whose future would be small in ways she had not foreseen. There were nights when the old instinct clawed at Damien, the hunger for swift justice, the taste for ferocious retribution. He still had friends who would have liked nothing more than a signal to act and clean the city's underbelly with a flick. He declined. He had seen what spilling blood would do to small lives. He had learned, finally, that sometimes to protect the people you love you must use the least dramatic engine available. Paperwork, witnesses, patient accumulation of truth. It was less glamorous. It was more human. Cray did what Cray did best. He expanded through legal channels and kept a ledger of favors that would tie him to banks and contracts. Damien watched from the sidelines with the affection of a man who knows how to admire a ruthless architect. When the architecture benefits a child's life, that admiration did not translate into softness. Cray was not sentimental. He was, however, reliable in the way modern commerce can be, cold but functional. Spring came and the city thawed in the way cities do, when scandals cool into headlines and then into case studies. Damien and Ivana took the boys to the park. Noah announced, solemnly, that he owned a locomotive. Ethan wanted jam on everything. They rolled down hills and fell into piles of grass. They learned that scars could be kissed and bandaged. Damien's hands were occasionally rough with the labor of a man who still fought the instinct to sign off everything with a command. He bought a small, used train set and taught the boys how to fix the wheels when they stuck. It was a small empire of wood and painted metal, and it belonged only to them. Neighbors watched with a mixture of curiosity and cautious affection. The estate's staff found new patterns that made room for toys in corridors and muddy shoes on certain mats. Arthur found delight in matching jam jars into display, a small domestic choreography that pleased him more than any formal dinner. Luca, who had always spoken little, sat in a corner of the workshop and taught Noah how to wind a clock. He had the dry sense of humor that delivered light in a room where solemnities tended to linger. Sometimes, in the quiet, Damien visited the places his life had once been less human. He walked to the docks and looked at the cranes. He went to meetings that negotiated numbers and didn't let sentiment cloud the arithmetic. He did not pretend that the past had been wiped clean. He had not surrendered his mind for a different fantasy. He had reconstituted his power into something that could protect, rather than terrify, two boys who slept with small fists curled like safe promises. One evening, months after the city had learned the truth about the Startlings, after trials and testimony had run their institutional course, Damien stood at the window where he had once pressed his forehead to cold glass after the train had taken a life he thought he had lost. The skyline had altered, but the rain's habit remained the same. It fell and revealed and did not, in the end, judge. He watched his sons at play in the courtyard, two small engines clattering along wooden rails he'd built with Luca. Noah laughed, high and easy. Ethan traced the path of the trains with a finger like a small cartographer. He felt his life reframed, not a throne but a hearth, not a crown but an iron key in his pocket, and a house that smelled of bread and small, loud life. He had made bargains, and he had accepted costs. He still bore the marks of a man who had once moved through the city with a different vocabulary. He still kept certain doors closed and certain levers engaged, but he had learned to choose what he would open, with what force. When night fell, and Ivana put the boys to bed, stories, songs, the gentle scolding for Gemma and the face Damien stayed a while longer in the living room, watching the way simple candlelight made the room a small cathedral of ordinary things. He took the iron key from the drawer, where he kept it now, and put it on the coffee table. He did not think of it as an end. It was the sign of a life being negotiated, a loose seal rather than a full stop. Outside, the city kept its commerce and its compromises. Victor Cray still negotiated at the docks. Special Agent Miller continued to root through more complicated cases. Henderson kept his watchful eye. The Startlings were a cautionary tale. Podcasts parsed the decisions and opinion pieces argued about the nature of power. Some said Damien had purchased redemption with territorial concessions. Others argued the opposite, that a man who pays for truth may be the rarest sort of merchant. Ivana fell asleep on the couch once, exhausted from a day of kneading and bookkeeping. Damien covered her with a blanket and watched her sleep. He thought about the train that had taken her away years ago and the train he now built with his son's hands. He thought about the iron key warm under his finger. He had not become a man without shadow. He had not been absolved. The city still whispered about the Moretti name in corners, but the boys slept, and in their sleep the city could not argue with a fact. Noah and Ethan existed. They were real and loud and imperfect, and they had a father who had learned to walk in a new syntax. When dawn came, he would be there for jam and arguments about trains. He would go to meetings in courtrooms and still keep the darker levers at a distance, because sometimes power is better used to close gates than to open wounds. He had swapped certain instruments of rule for others' legal counsel instead of threats, contracts instead of bribes, and in doing so he had accepted the ambiguity of a life half in light and half in the old gray business. He had never entirely escaped. That ambiguity was the most human thing he had ever owned. He took the iron key and, in a private gesture that was neither ceremony nor show, slid it across the coffee table where Ivana would find it when she woke. It was neither a promise of a castle nor an oath of sanctity. It was the best he could be at that moment. A man willing to lock and unlock doors, to admit that he had things to guard and a family worth guarding. The city would continue to judge and to whisper and to sell its versions of right and wrong for a price. Damien would continue to live inside those temptations and choices. For now, he slept in a room that smelled faintly of yeast and jam, and the faint oil of a train set. That was enough to remind him, every time he woke, who he had become and what he still needed to protect. Did he deserve a second chance? That is a question the city will always ask about men who have blood and business under their hands. The better question, perhaps, is whether those who are given second chances use them to rebuild more gently than before. For Damien, the answer was not a clean one. It was a slow workmanship of mornings and bedtimes, of legal filings and new names on property deeds, of the small domestic rituals that make a life steadier. If you saw the beginning of this story and stayed, tell us, did he deserve it? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe.